The town of San Miguel crouched in the shadow of the Colorado Rockies like something wounded and afraid. It wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered buildings pressed against the hard earth, their paint peeling under the constant assault of wind and sun. The main street stretched from the saloon at one end to the general store at the other, with the mayor's office sitting dead center like a rotten tooth in an otherwise ordinary mouth. Nobody came to San Miguel looking for opportunity anymore. The silver mine had played out 3 years back, and with it went any pretense of civilization. What remained was a town governed by fear, where honest men kept their heads down and their mouths shut, where women hurried through their errands with eyes fixed on the ground, where children learned early that silence was survival. At the heart of this fear sat Mayor Harold Finch, a soft-bellied man with watery eyes and hands that trembled when he signed documents. He'd been elected in better times, back when people still believed in things like law and progress. Now he was little more than a puppet, and everyone knew who pulled the strings. Jed Calder owned the territory 20 miles north, a stretch of rough country where the law had never reached and never would. He ran his gang from an old mining camp, and once a month he rode into San Miguel with his men to collect what he called protection money. The mayor called it a tax. The townspeople called it what it was, robbery with a smile. On this particular morning in late August of 1878, Mayor Finch sat in his office rehearsing the speech he'd give when Jed arrived. The words stuck in his throat like spoiled meat. Through his window, he could see the street, empty except for old Wesley Cooper sweeping the boardwalk in front of his store, the bristles of his broom raising small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. The mayor's hands shook as he poured himself a whiskey. It wasn't even noon yet, but some days started earlier than others. He was raising the glass to his lips when he heard it, the sound that had become synonymous with dread in San Miguel. Hoofbeats. But something was wrong. Jed always rode in with his full gang, 8 or 9 riders whose arrival sounded like distant thunder. This was different, just 2 horses, moving at an easy pace, almost leisurely. Mayor Finch moved to the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. What he saw made his whiskey glass slip from his fingers to shatter on the floor. 2 riders were coming up the main street. The one in front sat tall in his saddle, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. Even from a distance, even in the harsh light that washed the color from everything, one thing was unmistakable. The rider was black. In all the years Finch had lived in San Miguel, he'd seen exactly 3 black men pass through town. 2 had been soldiers heading west after the war, moving too fast to stop. The third had been a freed slave turned prospector who'd lasted exactly 1 week before the miners ran him off. The frontier wasn't kind to anyone, but it reserved a special cruelty for those whose skin marked them as different. This rider, though, didn't move like someone expecting trouble. He moved like someone who'd found it before and walked away. The second rider was older, lean as a fence post, with a gray beard that reached halfway down his chest. He had the weathered look of a man who'd spent his entire life outdoors, his face creased and sun-darkened like old leather. They reined in at the hitching post outside the mayor's office. The black man dismounted first, and Finch got his first clear look at him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled his dusty coat. He wore a gun belt slung low on his hips, and the revolver in the holster had the well-maintained look of a tool used often and cared for religiously. But it was his face that caught the mayor's attention. Strong features, a mouth set in a line that might have been carved from stone, and eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything. The older man dismounted slower, favoring his left leg slightly. He said something to his companion, who nodded once and started up the steps to the office. Mayor Finch scrambled back to his desk, trying to compose himself. He was sitting when the knock came. 3 solid raps that somehow sounded like a command rather than a request. "Come in," Finch called, hating how his voice cracked. The door opened and the black man filled the doorway. Up close he was even more imposing, not just his size, but the way he carried himself, the way his gaze swept the room and cataloged everything in seconds. The older man followed him in, closing the door behind them. "Mayor Finch?" The black man's voice was deep, with a slight rasp that suggested years of hard living. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you, gentlemen?" The black man reached into his coat, and Finch nearly dove under his desk. But what emerged wasn't a weapon. It was a letter, folded and sealed, though the seal was broken now. He placed it on the desk between them. Found this about 15 miles south. Stagecoach robbery, looks like. Driver and guard were dead, passengers scattered. This was in the mud. Finch's hands trembled as he picked up the letter. He recognized it immediately. It was the reply he'd sent 3 weeks ago to the territorial governor's office, requesting a sheriff. The governor had agreed to send someone, a man named Carson, who was supposed to arrive next month. The letter detailed the appointment, including the authority and salary that came with the position. This wasn't meant for you, Finch said carefully. Didn't figure it was. The black man's expression didn't change. But seems to me it arrived all the same. Town needs a sheriff. Letter says so. I'm here. Problem solved. Finch felt his stomach drop. Now, see here. That letter was for a specific individual, who ain't coming. The older man spoke for the first time, his voice gruff. We checked. That stage was hit by Jed Calder's boys. Everyone aboard is dead. Your sheriff died with a bullet in his back before he ever reached your town. The room fell silent. Through the window, Finch could hear the normal sounds of mourning, the creak of a wagon, someone calling to a friend, the distant ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith's shop. Normal sounds in a town that was anything but normal. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Finch said slowly, but the appointment of a sheriff requires already appointed. The black man tapped the letter. Says right there, badge, authority, salary, all legal and proper. I'm just accepting what was offered. To someone else. To whoever showed up to claim it. The man's eyes were steady, unwavering. Unless you're saying there's something specific that disqualifies me? The unspoken words hung in the air like smoke. Finch felt sweat trickle down his back despite the relative cool of his office. He was trapped, and he knew it. If he said what they both knew he was thinking, that a black man couldn't be sheriff, that the town wouldn't accept it, that it was impossible, he'd be admitting to prejudices that, while common, were increasingly frowned upon in official capacities. The war had been over for more than a decade. Reconstruction had happened, even if it hadn't reached as far as these remote territories. On paper, at least, the law was supposed to be equal. On paper. What's your name? Finch asked, stalling. Ryder Kane. Most folks call me Boss. Boss Kane. Finch tested the name, trying to imagine announcing it to the town. And you've been a lawman before? Bounty hunter. 5 years. Before that, cavalry scout. Before that, things that don't matter anymore. Bounty hunting isn't the same as being a sheriff. No, Boss agreed. It's harder. Sheriff's got a badge and the law behind him. Bounty hunter's got his wits and his gun. I've managed this long. Figure adding a badge will make things easier, not harder. The older man chuckled. Tell him the rest, Boss. Boss's expression flickered, something that might have been amusement, though it was hard to tell. Brought in 73 bounties, all of them breathing when I delivered them, all of them convicted. I don't shoot first and ask questions later. I bring people in to face justice. 73, Finch repeated weakly. That's right. Got letters from 3 different marshals saying I'm reliable. Want to see them? Finch shook his head. His mind was racing, trying to find a way out of this corner he'd been backed into. The problem was, San Miguel desperately needed a sheriff. Jed Calder's monthly visits were becoming weekly. His taxes were getting heavier. Just last month, he'd burned down a farm outside town because the family couldn't pay. The territorial governor had finally agreed to help, but help was supposed to come in the form of an experienced white lawman, someone the town would rally behind. Not this. Mr. Kane, Finch began, then stopped. How did you explain to a man that his skin color made him unsuitable without actually saying it? Boss, you seem like a capable individual, but San Miguel is complicated. We have existing arrangements, power structures, people who won't take kindly to change, Boss supplied. His voice was flat, giving nothing away. People never do. Still happens anyway. There's a man named Jed Calder. He controls the territory north of here. He and his gang, they're... Why you need a sheriff? The older man, Amos, Boss had called him, interrupted. We gathered that much. Town this size, this far from anything, should have someone wearing a badge. Fact that it doesn't tells a story all by itself. Finch felt his face flush. Now see here. We'll see ourselves, thanks. Boss picked up the letter and tucked it back into his coat. Badge in here, too. Guess that makes it official. We'll be setting up in the jail, assuming this town has one. End of the street, past the saloon, Finch said numbly. But you can't just can and am. Boss headed for the door, Amos following. He paused with his hand on the knob, looking back. One more thing, Mayor. This Jed Calder, when's he due back in town? End of the week, Friday. Boss nodded slowly, as if he'd expected as much. Good. Gives me 3 days to get settled. See you around, Mayor. They left, and Finch stood alone in his office, staring at the space where they'd been. Through the window, he watched them mount up and ride toward the other end of town. Already people were stopping to stare. Word would spread within the hour. Within minutes, probably. And when Jed Calder heard that San Miguel had a new sheriff, and that sheriff was a black man who'd claimed the badge for himself, Mayor Finch sat down heavily and reached for the whiskey bottle. His hands were shaking worse than ever. The jail was a squat adobe building with bars on the windows and a heavy wooden door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Boss and Amos tied their horses outside and pushed the door open. It groaned on rusty hinges, revealing a single room that smelled of dust and mouse droppings. There were 2 cells in the back, both empty, both with their doors standing open. A desk sat near the front, its surface buried under a thick layer of undisturbed dust. A pot-bellied stove crouched in one corner, cold and dark. A gun rack on the wall held nothing but cobwebs. Homie, Amos observed, running a finger through the dust on the desk and examining it critically. Ain't been used in a while. 3 years, I'd guess. Boss walked the perimeter of the room, his boots leaving prints in the dust. About the time the mine played out and the money dried up, sheriff probably left when there was nothing left to protect. Or when someone made it clear his services weren't needed. That too. Boss stopped at the window and looked out at the street. From here he could see most of the town laid out before him. The saloon, the Lucky Dollar, according to the faded sign, stood directly across the street. Beyond it, the general store, a boarding house, the blacksmiths, and a dozen other establishments that made up the commercial heart of San Miguel. Further out, he could see houses, most of them modest, a few larger ones that probably belonged to the town's wealthier citizens. People were gathering. Not obviously, frontier folk were too wary for that, but he could see them finding reasons to be outside, to linger in doorways, to glance repeatedly in the direction of the jail. Word had spread, just as he'd known it would. You sure about this? Amos asked quietly. Boss didn't turn from the window. No. Could still leave, find another town, one that wants a sheriff instead of fighting the idea. Could. Boss finally looked at his friend. They'd ridden together for 3 years now, ever since Amos had helped him track down a horse thief in New Mexico territory. The old scout had skills Boss needed, and Boss had given Amos something he'd been missing: purpose. You want to leave? Amos snorted. Hell no. Just making sure you know what you're walking into. Walked into worse. Fair point. Amos started opening drawers in the desk, finding nothing but more dust and a few dead beetles. So what's the play? We wait for this Jed Calder to show up and arrest him? If it was that simple, someone would have done it already. Boss pulled the letter from his coat and unpinned the badge from inside. A 5-pointed star, tarnished but solid. He polished it absently on his sleeve. No, Jed's got this town scared. They pay him to stay away, he stays away. Perfect arrangement for everyone. Except it ain't staying that way, is it? You said the stagecoach was hit. Driver and guard dead. That's escalation. That's greed. Boss pinned the badge to his vest, feeling its unfamiliar weight. Jed's gotten comfortable. Comfortable men get greedy. Greedy men get sloppy. We just need to push the right way, and he'll come to us. And then? Then we see if this badge means anything, or if it's just a piece of metal. A knock at the door interrupted them. 3 hesitant taps, almost apologetic. Boss and Amos exchanged a glance. Boss's hand dropped to the gun at his hip, a reflexive gesture born of years when visitors were rarely friendly. Come in, Boss called. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman. She was young, maybe 25, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical bun and a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Her face was pretty, despite the worry lines around her eyes and the tightness of her mouth. She held a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Sheriff?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. "That's what the badge says." Boss gestured to a chair, one of only two in the place, both looking like they might collapse under any weight. "Something I can help you with, miss?" "Clara May Henderson." She didn't sit, clutching the basket like a shield. "I heard there was a new lawman. Wanted to welcome you proper. Brought some bread and preserves." She set the basket on the desk, and Amos immediately pulled back the cloth, revealing a loaf of golden bread that was still warm and 2 jars of what looked like strawberry preserves. The old scout made an appreciative sound. "Been living on hardtack and jerky for 3 weeks, he said. "Ma'am, you're an angel." A ghost of a smile crossed Clara May's face, but it died quickly. She looked at Boss and he saw fear in her eyes. Not of him exactly, but of something larger, something that had settled over her life like a permanent shadow. "You shouldn't have come here," she said quietly. "People are already talking. They're saying you claimed the badge for yourself, that you had no right. Letter says otherwise. Letter won't matter, not to them, not to—" She trailed off, glancing toward the window as if worried someone might be listening. "Jed Calder?" She flinched at the name. "You know about him?" "Know enough. Know he's got this town under his thumb. Know the mayor would rather pay tribute than stand up. Know that's about to change." "You can't fight him." The words came out in a rush, desperate. "He's got at least 15 men, all of them killers. They do whatever he says. Last year a merchant refused to pay. Jed burned his store down with him inside. Nobody did anything. Nobody could." Boss studied her face. The fear there, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like hope, though she was trying hard to smother it. "Why did you really come here, Miss Henderson?" Clara May's hands tightened on the basket handle. For a long moment, she didn't speak. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My brother, Tommy. He's 17. Last month, Jed came to our farm. We've got a small place 5 miles out of town. Said Tommy owed him money. Gambling debt, he called it. Tommy swears he never gambled, never even met Jed's men. But Jed said he had witnesses. Said Tommy owed $500. $500. Boss whistled low. That was more money than most farmers saw in 2 years. "We don't have it. Could never have it." Jed said, he said Tommy could work it off. Took him 3 weeks ago. I haven't seen him since. Where'd he take him? The mining camp, 20 miles north. They're using it for something, nobody knows what. But men who go there don't come back the same, if they come back at all. Boss exchanged a look with Amos. Forced labor was common enough on the frontier. There were always men willing to use violence to get others to work for nothing. But doing it this openly, this brazenly, spoke to a level of control that went beyond simple outlawry. Jed Calder wasn't just a bandit, he was building something. "I'll look into it," Boss said. "You can't." Clara May's eyes widened. "You don't understand. Jed owns the sheriff. Owned, I mean. The last sheriff before he left. And he owns the mayor. He owns the judge in Silver Creek. That's the nearest town with a courthouse. He owns the marshal who's supposed to patrol this territory. Everyone who could do something takes his money and looks the other way. I don't." "You will, or you'll die." She said it with a terrible certainty, the voice of someone who'd seen too many good intentions die in the dust. "That's what happens here. You either bow down or you get put down. There's no third option." Boss walked to the window again, looking out at San Miguel. The gathering crowd had dispersed somewhat, but he could still see people watching the jail from various vantage points, waiting to see what would happen, waiting to see if this new sheriff would be any different from the old one, or if he'd just be another man who talked big and folded fast when the pressure came. "Miss Henderson," Boss said without turning around, "I've been put down before. Men have tried, anyway. I'm still here. They're not. Jed's different. No, he's not." Boss finally looked at her, and Clara May took an involuntary step back at the intensity in his eyes. "He bleeds like any other man. He can be hurt, and he can be stopped. Only reason he hasn't been is because everyone's too scared to try. Fear's a powerful thing, Miss Henderson. It can make 15 men seem like 50. It can make a bully seem invincible, but fear only works if people feed it. Starve it, and it dies. Clara May stared at him, something kindling in her expression. That hope again, stronger now, fighting against the fear that had ruled her for so long.
You really think you can help Tommy? I think I can try. That's more than anyone else is offering. She nodded slowly, then turned for the door. She paused with her hand on the knob. They'll come for you, she said. Not Jed, not yet, but the others. The men who benefit from how things are. The mayor, the saloon owner, the merchant who owns half the buildings in town. They'll try to run you off, and if that doesn't work... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Let them come. Clara May left, and Amos moved to stand beside Boss at the window, watching her hurry down the street with her empty basket. She's right, you know, Amos said. They will come, and they won't be friendly about it. I know. So what do we do? Boss turned from the window and surveyed their new headquarters. The dusty floor, the empty cells, the cold stove, the gun rack that held nothing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. First, we clean this place up. Can't enforce the law from a pigsty. Then we make ourselves visible. Walk the street, meet people, let them see the badge. Let them understand there's a new order in San Miguel. And when the old order comes calling, Boss smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Then we teach them that orders can change. Sometimes peaceful-like, sometimes not. Their choice. They spent the rest of the day transforming the jail from a forgotten relic into something resembling an actual place of law. Amos swept while Boss scrubbed the desk and oiled the hinges on the cell doors. They got the stove working and made coffee. Real coffee. Not the chicory-laced swill they'd been drinking on the trail. They found an old ledger in one of the drawers and cleaned it up, ready to record arrests and complaints. By late afternoon, the jail looked almost respectable. More importantly, it looked occupied, used, claimed. Boss stepped outside just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. The street was quieter now, most people having retreated indoors for supper, but he could still feel eyes on him, from the saloon across the street, from the boarding house windows, from the darkened doorway of the general store. He started walking, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. Amos fell in beside him, and together they walked the length of San Miguel's main street. They didn't hurry. They didn't act defensive or aggressive. They just walked, the badge on Boss's chest catching the fading sunlight and throwing it back in glints of metal. At the saloon, Boss paused. Through the window, he could see perhaps 20 men inside, drinking and playing cards. The sounds of rough laughter and clinking glasses spilled into the street. Might as well introduce ourselves, Boss said. Might as well, Amos agreed, though his hand rested easy on his gun. They pushed through the bat-wing doors into the Lucky Dollar Saloon. The room went quiet, not all at once, but in a wave that spread from the entrance to the back of the room as men registered the newcomers, especially as they registered the badge. The saloon was typical frontier fare, a long bar running down one side, tables scattered through the main floor, a piano in the corner that nobody was playing at the moment, and a narrow staircase leading to the second floor where the saloon girls conducted their other business. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey and cheaper beer. Boss walked to the bar, and the crowd parted before him like he was carrying disease. He could feel the hostility radiating from every corner of the room, a palpable thing, like heat from a stove. The bartender was a thick-necked man with arms like tree trunks and a face that had been broken and poorly set more than once. He didn't smile as Boss approached. "We're full up," the bartender said flatly. Boss looked around at the half-empty room. "That so? Private party. Looks pretty public to me." Boss leaned against the bar, casual but alert. "I'm the new sheriff. Name's Kane. Most call me Boss. Figure I should make myself known, seeing as how I'll be keeping the peace here." "We got all the peace we need," someone called from the back. Laughter followed. Boss didn't turn to look. "That right? Town seems pretty quiet. Almost too quiet. Like everyone's holding their breath, waiting for something bad to happen." "Nothing bad happens in San Miguel," the bartender said. "We got an arrangement. Keeps things calm. Arrangements can be renegotiated." Now the bartender did smile, and it wasn't friendly. "You really don't get it, do you? You walk in here with that badge like it means something, like it gives you power,
but that badge is just metal. Power comes from somewhere else entirely. From Jed Calder, you mean? The room, which had been buzzing with low conversation, went completely silent. Even mentioning Jed's name seemed like a transgression here, like cursing in church. You should leave, the bartender said quietly. Right now. Walk out that door, get on your horse, and ride. Don't stop until San Miguel is just a memory, because if you're still here when Jed comes back— He shook his head. Well, I've seen what happens to men who cross him. Ain't pretty. Boss straightened, his full height making him tower over the bar. I appreciate the warning, but I think I'll stay. See, I took an oath when I pinned on this badge, swore to uphold the law and protect the people of this town, and I keep my oaths. Even if it kills you? Especially then. A man stood up from one of the tables, big, bearded, with the look of a ranch hand who spent more time fighting than working. He walked toward Boss with the rolling gait of someone spoiling for confrontation. We don't want you here, the man said, stopping a few feet away. You ain't our sheriff. You're just some— He paused, clearly searching for words that wouldn't sound too openly racist. Some drifter who stole a badge. You got no authority. No right. Got both, actually. Boss pulled out the letter and held it up. Territorial governor appointed me. All legal and binding. You got a problem with it? Take it up with him. The bearded man's face flushed red. I got a problem with you. You don't belong here. Don't belong anywhere civilized folk try to live. Boss folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. Let me tell you something about belonging. I've been from Texas to Montana, from Kansas to California. I've eaten dust in a dozen territories, slept under more stars than you've counted in your whole life, and I've brought in men twice as mean as you before breakfast. I've earned my place in this world through sweat and blood and bullets. I don't need you or anyone to tell me where I belong. Big words for a man alone. Not alone, Amos spoke from behind Boss, his voice carrying across the silent room. And even if he was, I'd wager one of him against 10 of any of you. Seen him work. Ain't pretty, but it's effective. The bearded man's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Boss thought it might actually come to blows. Part of him almost hoped it would. It would be a quick way to establish the pecking order, to show that the new sheriff wasn't afraid of a fight. But the moment passed. The man backed down, muttering under his breath as he returned to his table. The tension in the room remained, thick and choking, but the immediate threat faded. Boss tipped his hat to the bartender. Nice talking with you. I'll be around if anyone needs anything. Legal problems, disputes, anything that falls under keeping the peace. That's what I'm here for. He and Amos walked out of the Lucky Dollar into the gathering dusk. Behind them, the saloon erupted in angry conversation, men processing what had just happened, trying to decide what it meant. Made friends everywhere you go, Amos observed dryly. Don't need friends. Need respect. Fear works too, if that's all I can get. You'll get plenty of that, I reckon. They walked back toward the jail as the sun finally dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Lanterns were being lit in windows up and down the street, small points of light pushing back against the gathering darkness. Boss paused outside the jail and looked up at the first stars beginning to appear. Somewhere to the north, Jed Calder was going about his business, unaware that his comfortable arrangement was about to be shattered. Somewhere in a mining camp, Tommy Henderson was working off a debt he'd never incurred, wondering if anyone would ever come for him. And here in San Miguel, in the space between what was and what could be, Boss Kane stood with a tarnished badge on his chest and a determination in his heart that no amount of threats could shake. 3 days, he said quietly. What's that? 3 days until Jed comes to town. 3 days to get ready. 3 days to show these people that fear doesn't have to be the only law in San Miguel. Amos nodded slowly. 3 days to change everything, or die trying. Yeah. Boss headed inside, already planning. That's about the size of it. The night settled over San Miguel like a blanket, heavy and complete. In the darkness, the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Change was coming, that much was certain. Whether it would arrive in the form of salvation or simply more violence remained to be seen. But in the jail, lamplight burned long into the night, and a man who refused to bow made his preparations for war. Dawn came to San Miguel with the kind of silence that precedes storms. Boss stood on the jailhouse steps, coffee steaming in his tin cup, watching the town wake up. Shopkeepers emerged to sweep their boardwalks, moving with the mechanical precision of people performing rituals they'd done 1,000 times before. Women hurried toward the general store with baskets on their arms, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground. A wagon rolled past, its driver giving Boss a wide berth and a suspicious glare. The morning stretched out before him like a test he hadn't studied for. 3 days until Jed Calder's return. 3 days to break a system that had calcified into something harder than stone. Amos emerged from inside, scratching his beard and yawning. "Sleep any?" "Some." Boss drained his coffee, feeling the bitter heat slide down his throat. "You?" "Like a baby. Course, I ain't the one wearing the target on his chest." Boss touched the badge reflexively. In the morning light, it looked less tarnished, almost dignified. Target implies someone's aiming. So far, all I'm getting is dirty looks and empty threats. Give it time. The mayor's probably in his office right now trying to figure out how to handle you without making it look like he's handling you. And the saloon owner, what's his name? Didn't ask. Well, whoever he is, he's got money tied up in keeping things exactly how they are. Men like that don't take kindly to disruption. As if summoned by their conversation, a figure appeared at the end of the street. Mayor Finch, moving with the reluctant determination of a man approaching a gallows he'd built himself. He walked slowly, pausing twice to mop his forehead with a handkerchief despite the morning cool. "Here we go," Boss muttered. Finch climbed the steps with visible effort, his breath coming hard. Up close, he looked worse than he had yesterday, eyes bloodshot, skin pale and clammy, hands trembling slightly. A man coming apart at the seams. Sheriff Kane. The title sounded like it hurt coming out. "Might we have a word? In private?" Boss gestured to the jail. "Office is right through there, such as it is." They went inside and Finch immediately gravitated to the chair, collapsing into it like his legs had given out. Boss leaned against the desk, arms crossed, waiting. Amos positioned himself by the door, ostensibly cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife, but actually standing guard. "You've created quite a stir," Finch began, then seemed to realize how weak that sounded. "What I mean is, people are concerned about the change, about what it represents." "Change scares people," Boss agreed, "but it happens anyway." "Yes, but does it have to happen like this? So suddenly, without consultation, or who would I consult? You? The man who's been letting this town be terrorized because it's easier than standing up? Or maybe the folks in the saloon who'd rather pay protection money than protect themselves?" Finch's face flushed. "You don't understand the situation. You ride in here with your badge and your righteousness thinking you can fix everything. But some things can't be fixed. Some problems are too big, too entrenched. Jed Calder isn't just an outlaw. He's a force of nature. Fighting him is like fighting a flood or a fire. You don't win. You survive. And we've been surviving." "By sacrificing people like Tommy Henderson?" The mayor's eyes widened. "Clara May came to see you." "She did. Told me about her brother. Told me about Jed's gambling debt scheme. How many others has he taken? How many young men are up in that mining camp working off debts they never incurred?" "I don't know the specifics. You don't want to know." Boss's voice hardened. "Because knowing means you'd have to act. And acting means putting yourself at risk. Easier to look away, tell yourself it's none of your business, that you're powerless to change it." "I am powerless." Finch's voice cracked, the words bursting out like a confession he'd been holding back for years. "You want the truth? Fine. Here it is. I've tried. When Jed first started coming around, when this whole protection arrangement began, I tried to stop it. I went to the territorial marshal. You know what he told me? He told me San Miguel was outside his jurisdiction unless I could prove a federal crime had been committed. I went to the judge in Silver Creek. He said he couldn't issue warrants based on hearsay. I even tried to organize the townspeople, form a militia. You know what happened? The night after my speech, someone burned down my barn, left a note that said my house would be next, with my wife inside. The silence that followed was heavy. Finch stared at his hands, which had stopped trembling and were now clenched into white-knuckled fists. "I'm a coward," he said quietly. "I know that. I wake up knowing it, I go to sleep knowing it, but I'm a living coward. And I'd rather be that than a dead hero." Boss studied the mayor with something approaching sympathy. Finch wasn't evil. He was just broken, worn down by a system that punished courage and rewarded submission. "Where's your wife now?" Boss asked. "Denver. Sent her there 2 years ago. Told her it was temporary, that I'd follow once things settled down. But things never settle down, do they? They just get worse, so gradually you don't notice until you can't remember what normal looked like." Boss pushed off from the desk and walked to the window. Outside, San Miguel was going about its morning business. Every person wrapped in their own private fear, their own accommodation with tyranny. "I'm not asking you to be a hero," Boss said. "I'm asking you to be a mayor. Do your job. Support the law. Let me do mine. And when Jed comes, when he demands you leave or die, what then? Then we'll find out if that badge means anything." Finch stood, his expression a mixture of pity and resignation. "You're going to die, Sheriff Kane. Maybe not this week, maybe not this month, but eventually. And when you do, everything will go back to how it was, because that's what always happens. The system is bigger than any one man, even a brave one." He left, and Boss listened to his footsteps fade down the street. Amos came to stand beside him at the window. "He ain't wrong," the old scout said. "About the odds, anyway." "Odds have never been in my favor. Still here. There's a difference between hunting bounties and standing in one place, daring someone to come kill you." "Is there?" Boss turned from the window. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty much the same. Someone needs stopping, I stop them. Simple as that." "Nothing about this is simple." Before Boss could respond, shouting erupted from outside. They both moved to the door in time to see a crowd forming near the general store. At the center of it, 2 men were grappling in the dust. One older, gray-haired, his store apron covered in dirt. The other younger, maybe 30, with the hard-muscled build of a ranch hand. Boss was moving before he'd fully processed what he was seeing. He crossed the street at a run, Amos struggling to keep up with his longer strides. The crowd parted as Boss approached, and he stepped between the 2 fighters just as the ranch hand drew back his fist for another blow. "That's enough," Boss said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from absolute conviction. The ranch hand turned his rage on Boss. "This don't concern you. I'm the sheriff. Everything in this town concerns me. What's the problem?" "Problem is this cheat sold me rancid bacon." The ranch hand pointed at the shopkeeper, who was clutching his jaw and spitting blood into the dirt. "Whole pound of it. Spoiled. Made my crew sick. Could have killed someone." The shopkeeper, Wesley Cooper, Boss remembered from the day before, struggled to his feet. "Wasn't spoiled when I sold it. You probably left it out in the sun. Let it go bad, and now you want your money back." "I want more than my money back. You lying." Boss held up a hand, cutting off what was about to become another round of fighting. "Mr. Cooper, you got that bacon still? The batch this came from?" Wesley hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "In the back. But it ain't spoiled, I'm telling you. Let's take a look." They moved into the general store, Boss and the ranch hand and Wesley Cooper, with Amos and half the crowd following. The store was cramped and cluttered, shelves packed with everything from flour and sugar to boots and rope. Wesley led them to the back room, where slabs of bacon hung from hooks and barrels of various goods stood in rows. Boss examined the bacon, sniffing it, checking the color and texture. It didn't take long to see the problem. The meat had a grayish tinge and a sour smell that spoke of spoilage. "When did this shipment come in?" Boss asked. 3 weeks ago. Been keeping it cool as I can, but..." Wesley trailed off, his defiance crumbling. "It's been hot. Real hot. Maybe I should have checked it more careful before selling it." "Maybe you should have." Boss turned to the ranch hand. "Your money back and replacement bacon sound fair?" The ranch hand looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Boss's expression made him reconsider. "I guess. But he's got to stop selling bad goods." "Mr. Cooper?" Boss looked at the shopkeeper. "That going to be a problem?" Wesley shook his head, defeated. "No, Sheriff, no problem." The refund was made, apologies were exchanged, and the crowd dispersed, disappointed that the fight hadn't escalated into something more entertaining. Boss started back toward the jail, but Wesley Cooper called after him. "Sheriff? A word?" Boss waited while Wesley shuffled over, looking embarrassed and grateful in equal measure. "Thank you," Wesley said quietly, "for handling that. Usually when there's a dispute, it either ends in a beating or someone goes to Jed to settle it." "Jed settles disputes?" "In his way. He charges for it, of course, but people pay because at least then it's over. You did it for free. And fair." Boss shrugged. "That's the job." "Yeah, well, not everyone sees it that way." Wesley glanced around, making sure no one was close enough to hear. "Be careful, Sheriff. Jack Reeves, the man who owns the Lucky Dollar, he's already talking about you. Says you're stirring up trouble, making people question the arrangement. He's got the mayor's ear, and he's got money to back up whatever he wants to do." "I'll keep that in mind." "I mean it. Jack doesn't fight fair, and he doesn't fight alone. He'll come at you sideways, when you're not looking." Wesley paused, then added, "But I'm glad you're here. Someone needed to stand up. Just don't get yourself killed doing it." Boss walked back to the jail, processing what Wesley had said. The saloon owner, Jack Reeves, was the money behind the mayor's cowardice. That made sense. Men like Reeves thrived in chaos, made profits off other people's fear. A strong sheriff who actually enforced the law would be bad for business. The rest of the day passed in a series of small interventions. Boss broke up another fight, this one between two drunks outside the saloon. He helped a woman whose wagon had lost a wheel, lifting it while Amos hammered the wheel back into place. He walked the streets, making himself visible, letting people see that the law had returned to San Miguel. And with each interaction, he could feel the town beginning to shift. Not openly, people were too scared for that, but in small ways. A nod of acknowledgement here, a whispered thank you there. The kind of tiny cracks that, given time and pressure, could split a boulder. Evening found him back at the jail, writing in the ledger. He'd recorded the bacon dispute, the fights, even the wagon repair. Official documentation of a sheriff doing his job. Small things, maybe, but they mattered. They established precedent, created a record that said someone had stood up. Amos was cooking beans on the stove, the smell filling the small jail with something approaching comfort. "We got company," he said without looking up. Boss glanced out the window. A man was approaching, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a tailored suit and polished boots that looked out of place on the dusty street. Mid-40s with slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jack Reeves had to be. Boss opened the door before the man could knock. "Help you?" "Sheriff Kane," Reeves extended a hand. "Jack Reeves. I own the Lucky Dollar. Thought I should introduce myself proper, seeing as how we're going to be neighbors." Boss shook the offered hand, noting the soft palm and manicured nails. Not a man who did his own dirty work. "Mr. Reeves, mind if I come in? Got a proposition I think you'll find interesting." Boss stepped aside, and Reeves entered with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. He glanced around the jail with barely concealed disdain, then turned that calculating smile on Boss. "I'll get straight to it," Reeves said. "You seem like a practical man, so I'll speak practically. San Miguel has a certain ecosystem. Everyone has their role, their place in the order of things. When that ecosystem gets disrupted, bad things happen. People get hurt. People are already getting hurt. True, but they're the right people, the ones who can't or won't play by the rules." Reeves perched on the edge of the desk, casual, like he owned the place. "You, though, you're an unknown quantity. You come in here, start changing things, and suddenly people get ideas. Dangerous ideas about resistance, about standing up. And when they stand up, they get knocked down. Hard. So you're here to warn me? I'm here to offer you a deal." Reeves pulled out a leather wallet and counted out bills. Crisp, clean money that looked like it had come straight from a bank. $200. That's more than the territorial governor is paying you for a month's work. You take this, you get on your horse, and you ride. Tell the governor the job didn't work out, that San Miguel didn't want a sheriff. Everyone wins. Boss looked at the money, more cash than he'd seen in 6 months of bounty hunting. Enough to live comfortably for a while, to not have to chase desperados through the desert or sleep on rocky ground. "And if I don't take it?" Reeves's smile faded. then you're choosing a hard road. See, I don't make this offer lightly. I'm giving you a chance to walk away with dignity and cash. But if you refuse, if you insist on being a problem, then you become something that needs solving. And I'm very good at solving problems. That a threat? It's a fact. Reeves stood, leaving the money on the desk. Think about it. You got until tomorrow noon. After that, the offer expires and other methods come into play. He walked to the door, then paused. One more thing. That girl, Clara Mae Henderson, her brother's debt is real. Jed has witnesses, records, everything legal and proper. You go poking around in that, you'll find yourself on the wrong side of the law you're supposedly upholding. Just something to consider. After Reeves left, Boss stared at the money on the desk. Amos came over and picked up one of the bills, holding it up to the lamplight. Probably not even counterfeit, the old scout said. Real money for a real betrayal. $200. Boss's voice was flat. That's what they think my integrity costs. To be fair, they probably started lower and worked their way up. Boss laughed despite himself, a sharp bark of sound that held no humor. He picked up the money, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his pocket. What are you doing? Amos asked. Keeping it as evidence. When this is over, I want to be able to show exactly how corrupt this system is. Every bribe, every threat, every compromise they asked for and didn't get. That night, Boss lay on the cot in one of the cells, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept turning over the day's events, looking for patterns, for weaknesses in the wall of fear and corruption that surrounded him. Clara Mae's brother held on false charges. The mayor, too scared to act. The shopkeeper, grateful for simple fairness. Jack Reeves, offering money to make problems disappear. And looming over it all, Jed Calder, the unseen hand that controlled everything. 2 more days until Jed returned. 2 more days to prepare. Boss must have dozed eventually because he woke to Amos shaking his shoulder. Company, the old scout said tersely, and they don't look friendly. Boss rolled off the cot and grabbed his gun belt, buckling it on as he moved to the window. Dawn was just breaking, painting the street in shades of gray and gold, and in that pale light he could see them, at least a dozen men, all armed, forming a semicircle in front of the jail. At their center stood a man Boss recognized from the saloon, the bearded ranch hand who'd challenged him that first night. But this wasn't a drunk looking for a fight. This was organized, deliberate. Boss opened the door and stepped out, Amos right behind him. The morning air was cool against his face, carrying the smell of dust and horses and the tang of gun oil. Help you, gentlemen? Boss kept his voice level, conversational. The bearded man spat into the dirt. You had your chance to leave, should have taken it. That right? That's right. See, we had a meeting last night. The business owners, the ranchers, the folks who actually matter in this town. We talked about you, about how you're disrupting things, causing problems where there weren't none before. We voted, unanimous. You need to go. Voted? Boss almost smiled. This is a democracy now? This is a town protecting itself. We're giving you one last chance. Get on your horse and ride. Don't come back. And if I refuse? The men shifted, hands moving toward their weapons. The threat was clear, even if unspoken. Boss descended the steps slowly, each movement deliberate. He walked toward the semicircle of armed men, and to their credit, none of them backed away. He stopped about 10 feet from the bearded man, close enough to see the nervous sweat on his forehead despite the morning cool. Let me tell you something about votes, Boss said. They're real good for deciding where to build a schoolhouse or what to name a street, but they don't mean spit when it comes to the law. I was appointed by the territorial governor. That appointment doesn't get revoked because a bunch of scared men had a meeting. We ain't scared. You're terrified. Boss's voice cut through the protest like a knife. Every one of you. You're scared of Jed Calder, scared of what he'll do when he finds out you've got a real sheriff. So you're trying to get rid of me before he gets back, hoping that'll smooth things over. But here's what you're not understanding. Getting rid of me won't change anything. Jed will still come. He'll still demand his tribute. He'll still take what he wants. The only difference is there won't be anyone standing between him and you. We can handle Jed. Can you? Boss's gaze swept across the assembled men. Because from where I'm standing, you can't even handle me. 12 of you, armed and ready, and you're still just talking. You know why? Because deep down, You know that if bullets start flying, some of you are going to die, and none of you want to be the first. The silence that followed was suffocating. Boss could see the calculation in their eyes, the weighing of courage against self-preservation. These weren't killers. They were ordinary men pushed into an extraordinary situation, trying to survive the only way they knew how. "I'll make you a counteroffer," Boss said. "Go home. Go back to your businesses, your ranches, your families. Let me do my job. When Jed comes, I'll handle him. If I fail, well, you'll be rid of me anyway. But if I succeed—" He let the sentence hang in the air, pregnant with possibility. "If you succeed, Jed will burn this town to the ground," someone called from the back. "Maybe, or maybe he'll bleed out in the street and San Miguel will finally be free. Only one way to find out." The bearded man's jaw worked, grinding teeth. Boss could see him struggling with the decision, could see the moment when fear finally won out over anger. "This ain't over," the bearded man said, but he was already backing away. "When Jed gets here, when he shows you what real power looks like, don't expect us to stand with you." "Wouldn't dream of it," Boss said. The mob dispersed, men drifting away in twos and threes, their rebellion crumbling before it had truly begun. Boss watched them go, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from his system. "Well," Amos said from the jailhouse steps, "that could have gone worse. Could have gone better too. What now?" Boss looked toward the northern horizon, where somewhere beyond the mountains, Jed Calder was preparing for his monthly visit to San Miguel. One more day. 24 hours until everything came to a head. "Now we get ready," Boss said, "because talk is over. When Jed rides in tomorrow, it won't be speeches and threats. It'll be blood and bullets, and I intend to make sure it's his blood, not mine." They spent the day fortifying their position, though Boss knew no amount of preparation would matter if Jed came with his full force. Amos checked their ammunition. They had maybe 50 rounds between them, enough for a fight, but not a war. Boss walked the perimeter of the town, noting sight lines and cover positions, places where a man could make a stand or beat a retreat. The townspeople watched him with a mixture of curiosity and dread, like spectators at a bullfight who couldn't decide whether to cheer for the matador or the bull. Some ducked inside when he passed. Others nodded, their expressions carefully neutral. A few, a very few, offered words of encouragement, whispered so quietly they were almost prayers. It was late afternoon when Clara May appeared at the jail again, this time without a basket. Her face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep or both. She twisted her hands together as she climbed the steps, and Boss could see them trembling. "Sheriff," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." Boss gestured her inside, away from the eyes and ears of the street. Amos excused himself, stepping outside to give them privacy. Clara May sank into the chair like her legs had given out, and for a long moment she just sat there, breathing hard, gathering courage. "Tommy's not the only one," she finally said. "Jed's taken at least 6 young men from around here, maybe more. All of them on false debts, all of them sent to that mining camp. Nobody knows exactly what he's doing up there, but the rumors—" She swallowed hard. "They say he's not mining. They say he's building something, training men, creating an army." Boss felt ice slide down his spine. An army. That changed everything. If Jed was organizing on that scale, then this wasn't just about protecting San Miguel. This was about stopping something much larger before it spread. "Who told you this?" "A man came through town 2 weeks ago, said he'd escaped from the camp. He was half-starved, beaten bloody. He stayed just long enough to warn us, then disappeared. Said Jed was planning something big, something that would make his current operations look like child's play." "And nobody reported this? Nobody went to the marshal?" Clara May's laugh was bitter. "The marshal works for Jed. Everyone knows it. Going to him would be like asking the wolf to protect the sheep." She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "You have to understand, this isn't just about collecting protection money anymore. Jed wants control, real control. He wants to own every town from here to the Utah border, and he's got the men and the resources to do it." Boss paced the small jail, his mind racing. If Clara May was right, then confronting Jed tomorrow wasn't going to be a simple shootout. It would be the opening move in something much larger, much more dangerous. "I shouldn't have come to you," Clara May continued. "I shouldn't have asked for help."
Now Tommy's in more danger, and you—" She stood abruptly. "You should leave. Tonight. Before it's too late. I was selfish, thinking someone could save him. Nobody can save any of us." "Sit down, Miss Henderson." The command in Boss's voice was so absolute that Clara May dropped back into the chair without thinking. Boss crouched in front of her, his eyes level with hers. "Your brother is not going to die in that camp. Jed Calder is not going to build his empire, and this town is not going to spend another day living in fear. Those are facts. The only question is how much blood gets spilled, making those facts real. You can't promise that." "I just did." Boss stood, his decision made. "Amos and I are going to that mining camp tonight. We're going to get your brother and anyone else being held there. And then tomorrow, when Jed comes looking for his prisoners, we're going to have a conversation about his future in this territory. That's suicide. The camp is guarded. He's got men there, armed men. I've dealt with armed men before." Boss pulled his gun, checked the cylinder, spun it with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "Besides, they won't be expecting visitors. Element of surprise counts for a lot." Clara May stared at him like he'd announced plans to fly to the moon. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk this? You don't know me, don't know Tommy. We're nothing to you." Boss considered the question. Why was he doing this? The easy answer was duty. He'd taken an oath, pinned on a badge, sworn to protect and serve. But the real answer went deeper than that. It went back to a childhood spent watching people turn away when trouble came. It went back to a war where he'd fought for a country that didn't see him as fully human. It went back to 1,000 small humiliations and injustices that had taught him one fundamental truth. If you don't stand up, you spend your whole life on your knees. "Because someone has to," he said simply. "And I'm here." After Clara May left, Boss and Amos prepared for the night's work. They checked their weapons, filled canteens, packed what supplies they could carry. The plan was simple, because simple plans were the only ones that survived contact with reality. They'd ride north, scout the camp, wait for the guards to settle into their night routines, then move in fast and hard. "You know this is crazy," Amos said as they saddled their horses in the gathering dusk. "Known crazier things to work." "Name one." "That time in New Mexico. 3 men holed up in that abandoned fort, holding those settlers hostage. Everyone said we couldn't get in without getting someone killed. We almost did get killed. You took a bullet through your hat. Almost only counts in horseshoes." Boss swung into his saddle, feeling the familiar creak of leather. "Besides, we got everyone out alive. That's what matters." They rode out as the last light faded from the sky, heading north along a trail that was barely more than a suggestion in the dirt. The mountains loomed ahead, dark shapes against a darkening sky. Stars began to emerge, cold and distant, offering no comfort and no judgment. The ride took 3 hours, following Clara May's directions and Amos's uncanny sense of direction. They moved slowly, careful not to make noise, stopping frequently to listen. The night was alive with sounds, insects chirping, an owl calling, the distant howl of a coyote, but no human sounds. Not yet. The mining camp revealed itself gradually, first as a glow against the mountainside, then as distinct points of firelight, finally as an actual structure. It was bigger than Boss had expected, a sprawl of rough buildings surrounding the old mine entrance, with tents and lean-tos scattered around the perimeter. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and he could see men moving between buildings, their silhouettes backlit by the fires. They left their horses tied in a stand of pines about a quarter-mile out and approached on foot. Boss moved like a ghost, years of tracking men through hostile territory having taught him how to use shadows and silence. Amos followed, just as quiet despite his age and bad leg. From a ridgeline overlooking the camp, they could see the full layout. The main building, probably the old mine office, looked like it served as headquarters. Guards patrolled in pairs, making circuits around the camp perimeter. Boss counted 12 men visible, but there would be more inside the buildings. Too many to fight directly. They'd have to be smart. "There," Amos whispered, pointing to a long, low building with bars on the windows. "That's got to be where they're keeping the prisoners." Boss studied it, memorizing the guard patterns, the distance to cover, the potential escape routes. 2 guards stood outside the prison building, but they looked bored, slouching against the wall and passing a bottle between them. Not expecting trouble.
That was good. They waited an hour, watching the camp settle into its nighttime routine. Fires were banked. Men retired to their bunks. The guard rotation changed, the fresh pair no more alert than the previous ones. And slowly, carefully, Boss and Amos made their way down from the ridge. The approach was agonizing, 20 minutes of moving inches at a time, freezing whenever a guard looked their direction, using every scrap of cover the terrain offered. Boss's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady. Fear was information, not paralysis. They reached the back of the prison building without being spotted. The walls were rough timber, gaps between the planks wide enough to peer through. Boss pressed his eye to one gap and looked inside. The interior was dim, lit only by a single lantern hanging from a beam. He could see men lying on bunks or sitting on the floor, maybe a dozen of them, all young, all bearing the marks of hard labor and harder treatment. Bruises, gaunt faces, the hollow-eyed look of people who'd given up hope. One of them had to be Tommy Henderson. Boss moved along the wall until he found another gap, this one large enough to speak through without being overheard by the guards out front. "Tommy Henderson," he whispered. "Which one of you is Tommy Henderson?" Movement inside. A young man stood up from a bottom bunk, his face turning toward the voice. Even in the poor light, Boss could see the family resemblance. The same honey-colored hair as Clara May, the same fine features, though his were sharper now with hunger and fear. "Who's asking?" Tommy's voice was cautious, beaten down, but not broken. "Your sister sent me. I'm the new sheriff in San Miguel. I'm getting you out of here." Tommy moved closer to the wall, and other men followed, hope kindling in their eyes like struck matches. "You can't. The doors are locked from outside. Guards everywhere. We tried once. They beat us for days after." "I'm not asking permission." Boss moved to the front corner of the building where he could see the two guards. They were still passing the bottle, their rifles leaning against the wall, well out of easy reach. Sloppy. Jed had gotten too comfortable, too confident that his prisoners were cowed and his power absolute. Boss caught Amos's eye and gestured. The old scout nodded understanding and began working his way around to the other side of the building. They'd practiced this maneuver before, coming at a target from two directions simultaneously, giving adversaries too many things to respond to at once. Boss waited until Amos was in position, then stepped around the corner into the firelight. The guards looked up, surprise registering on their faces. A black man with a badge, appearing out of nowhere like a ghost made solid. "Evening, boys," Boss said conversationally. "I'm here for the prisoners. You can let them go peaceful, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." For a moment, the tableau held, the guards frozen in confusion, Boss standing relaxed but ready, the whole camp holding its breath. Then one guard reached for his rifle. Boss's hand moved in a blur. His gun was out and leveled before the guard's fingers touched wood. "I wouldn't," he said softly. "I really wouldn't." Amos emerged from the shadows behind them, his own weapon drawn. "Do like he says, nice and easy, and you get to see morning." The guard's hands came up slowly. Boss gestured with his gun. "Keys, now!" One guard pulled a ring of keys from his belt and tossed them over. Boss caught them one-handed, never taking his eyes off the men. "Inside! Move!" He backed them into the prison building, where the captives scrambled away from the door. Boss locked the guards in one of the empty cells, then turned to face Tommy and the others. "Anyone too hurt to ride?" They shook their heads. They were battered, exhausted, but adrenaline was already bringing color back to their faces. Freedom did that. Even the possibility of it could resurrect the nearly dead. "Then let's go. Quiet as you can. We've got horses stashed a quarter-mile south. Stay together, stay low, and for the love of everything, don't make noise." They filed out into the night, 12 men plus Boss and Amos. Too many for stealth, really, but they didn't have a choice. Boss led them away from the camp, moving fast but careful, knowing that any moment someone could raise an alarm and everything would go to hell. They were halfway to the horses when a shout rang out behind them. Boss didn't turn to look. "Run!" he commanded. "All of you, run!" The night erupted in chaos. More shouts, the sound of men scrambling, then the crack of rifle fire. Bullets whined through the darkness, thudding into trees and kicking up dirt. The freed prisoners ran, stumbling in the dark, fear giving them speed they shouldn't have possessed. Boss and Amos brought up the rear, returning fire when targets presented themselves. Not trying for kills, just making enough noise and danger to slow the pursuit. It worked. The guards hung back, unwilling to charge blindly into the darkness toward men who shot with such accuracy. They reached the horses in a confused mass. There weren't enough mounts for everyone. Boss had known there wouldn't be. "Double up," he shouted. "2 to a horse. Tommy, with me." Tommy swung up behind Boss, gripping his waist as Boss spurred the horse into motion. The others followed, a ragged cavalry fleeing into the night. Behind them, the camp was fully aroused now, men running for horses, organizing a pursuit. But they had a head start, and darkness was on their side. The ride back was brutal, pushing the horses hard, taking risks on the trail that could have broken legs or necks in the darkness. But fear was an excellent motivator, and slowly, gradually, the sounds of pursuit faded behind them. Dawn was breaking when they finally saw San Miguel in the distance, the town painted gold and pink by the rising sun. Boss slowed the horses to a walk, letting them blow. Behind him, Tommy Henderson was shaking, whether from cold or fear or relief, Boss couldn't tell. "You did it," Tommy said, his voice full of wonder. "You actually did it." "Not yet." Boss looked ahead to the town, to the jail where this had all started just 3 days ago. This was the easy part. Now comes the hard part. Because Jed Calder would be coming, and when he arrived, he wouldn't be coming to talk. They entered San Miguel as the town was waking, their appearance causing a sensation. People emerged from houses and shops, staring in disbelief at the freed prisoners. Clara May was one of the first to reach them, tears streaming down her face as Tommy slid off the horse and into her arms. "You came back," she sobbed. "You're alive, you're here, you're safe." Tommy held his sister tight. "The sheriff got us out, all of us." Boss dismounted, every muscle in his body screaming with fatigue. He'd been in the saddle for nearly 10 hours, fighting and riding and fighting again. But there was no time to rest. He turned to find Mayor Finch standing at the edge of the crowd, his face pale. "What have you done?" Finch whispered. "My job," Boss said flatly. "Found men being held illegally, freed them. That's what sheriffs do." "You've killed us all. When Jed finds out, he'll come here looking for blood. I know, that's the idea." Finch's eyes widened. "You wanted this? You wanted to provoke him?" "Had to happen sometime. Better on my terms than his." Boss started toward the jail, then stopped. He raised his voice so the gathering crowd could hear. "Jed Calder will be here today, probably by noon. He's going to be angry. He's going to want revenge. Anyone who wants to leave town, now's the time. Get your families, head for Silver Creek or Denver or anywhere else. I won't think less of you for it." The crowd murmured, people exchanging glances. Some began to move, heading back to their homes to gather belongings. But others, not many, but some, stayed put. Wesley Cooper from the general store. A rancher boss had helped with a property dispute. A handful of others who'd suffered under Jed's tyranny and were tired of running. "We're staying," Wesley called out. "If you're making a stand, Sheriff, then someone ought to stand with you. I can't ask that of you." "You ain't asking. We're offering." Wesley looked around at the others who'd remained. "Figure it's time we stopped letting one man dictate how we live." Boss felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, gratitude mixed with a fierce protectiveness for these people who'd found courage they didn't know they had. "All right then. Amos, get these men armed. Anything in the gun rack, anything anyone's willing to spare. We're going to turn this town into a fortress." The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Barricades went up at both ends of the main street. Windows were shuttered. Women and children were sent to the boarding house, the largest building in town, made of stone, defensible if everything went wrong. Men who could shoot were positioned in second-story windows and on rooftops. Boss moved through it all like a general before battle, giving orders, checking positions, making sure everyone knew the plan. The plan was simple. When Jed arrived, they'd talk first, give him a chance to back down, to ride away and leave San Miguel alone. And if he refused, when he refused, they'd be ready. It was Jack Reeves who broke the preparations, appearing at the jail with fury written across his face. You've destroyed everything, he shouted. Years of careful balance, of keeping the peace, and you've destroyed it in 3 days. There was no peace, Boss said tiredly. Just surrender dressed up to look like it. Surrender keeps people alive. What you're doing, this insanity, it's going to get everyone killed. Reeves grabbed Boss's arm, desperation replacing his usual smooth confidence. Please, it's not too late. We can fix this. Give the prisoners back, apologize, offer compensation. Boss shook off the grip. I'm not giving anyone back. Those men were held illegally. They're free now and they're staying free. Then you're condemning this entire town to death. Maybe, Boss met Reeves's eyes. Or maybe I'm giving it a chance to live. Really live, not just exist under someone else's thumb. Guess we'll find out. Reeves stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Boss watched him go, feeling no satisfaction. He understood Reeves's position. The man had built his life around accommodation and compromise, around finding ways to profit from other people's fear. Having that structure torn down was genuinely terrifying for him, but terror was the price of change. Always had been. Noon came and went, the sun climbed high, turning San Miguel into an oven. Men sweated behind their barricades, gripping rifles with slick palms. Boss stood in the middle of the street, alone, the badge on his chest catching the light, waiting. They heard Jed's approach before they saw him, the sound of many horses moving at a deliberate pace, not rushing, not worried, the sound of men who knew they were about to deliver punishment and were savoring the anticipation. They appeared at the north end of town, riding through the heat shimmer like a fever dream made real. Jed Calder rode at their head, and Boss got his first clear look at the man who'd terrorized this territory. Jed was younger than Boss had expected, maybe 35, with sandy hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty etched into every line. He sat his horse like a king surveying conquered territory, confident and utterly self-assured. Behind him rode at least 20 men, all armed, all hard-eyed veterans of violence. They stopped 50 yards from where Boss stood. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The entire town held its breath. Then Jed smiled. It was the smile of a predator who'd cornered particularly amusing prey. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air, "you must be the fool everyone's been talking about, the one who thinks a badge makes him special." "Sheriff Kane," Boss said, "and you're Jed Calder. We need to talk." "About what? About how you stole my property? About how you need to die for that? About how your days of terrorizing this town are over. You can ride away now, start somewhere else. Or you can stay and face justice for kidnapping, extortion, and murder. Your choice." Jed threw back his head and laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. His men joined in, the laughter rolling down the street like thunder. When he finally stopped, he was wiping tears from his eyes. "Justice," he repeated. "That's rich. You hear that, boys? He wants to arrest me." More laughter, darker this time. "Let me explain something to you, Sheriff Kane. There is no justice out here. There's only power. And I've got more power in one finger than you've got in your whole body." "We'll see." Jed's smile faded. "Yes, we will." He turned to his men. "Bring her forward." 2 riders moved apart, revealing a third horse between them. And tied to that horse, battered and terrified, was Clara May Henderson. Boss felt his blood turn to ice. He heard Tommy's anguished cry from somewhere behind him, quickly muffled. Clara May's face was bruised, her dress torn, her hair wild. But her eyes found Boss and held, filled with an apology and a plea. "Found her at her farm," Jed said casually. "Figured she might be useful. Turns out I was right." He drew his gun, a casual motion, and pressed the barrel against Clara May's temple. "Here's how this works, Sheriff. You're going to walk over here, nice and slow. You're going to take off that badge and hand it to me. Then you're going to get on your knees, and then—" He cocked the hammer. "Then we'll see how long you last under the sun." Boss stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to act, to move, to do something. But there was nothing to do. 20 guns against 1. Clara May's life hanging by the thinnest of threads. All his preparation, all his planning, all his courage. None of it mattered now. Jed had won, and they both knew it. "Tick-tock, Sheriff," Jed said, pressing the gun harder against Clara May's head. She whimpered, the sound cutting through Boss like a knife. My trigger finger's getting awful tired. Boss took a step forward, then another. The badge on his chest felt like a millstone, dragging him down toward surrender and death. Behind him, he could hear men moving, could feel the barricades he'd built crumbling before the first shot was fired. This was how it ended, not in a blaze of glory, but in the dust, with an innocent woman's life as leverage. This was the price of standing up, of refusing to bow. And somewhere deep inside, in a place beyond fear and rage and despair, Boss Kane began to plan. Because he wasn't dead yet. And until he was, the fight wasn't over. Boss took another step, his mind racing through impossible calculations. 20 guns. 1 hostage. 50 yards of open ground. The mathematics of death spelled out in dust and sunlight. But mathematics didn't account for everything. Didn't account for the rage building in his chest like a storm, or the way Clara May's eyes held his with a terrible understanding. She knew she was already dead. They both did. The only question was how many others would die with her. Boss's hand moved toward the badge on his chest, his fingers touching the tarnished metal. Jed's smile widened, victory already tasting sweet on his tongue. Behind Boss, he could feel the town's hope dying, could sense men lowering their weapons in defeat. Then Clara May spoke, her voice raw but clear. "Don't you dare!" Boss froze. Jed's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare give up," Clara May continued, blood trickling from her split lip. "Not for me. Not for anyone. You stand there and you fight, Sheriff Kane. You show them what courage looks like." "Shut your mouth," Jed snarled, pressing the gun harder against her temple. "Or what? You'll kill me?" Clara May actually laughed, a broken sound that held more defiance than fear. "You're going to do that anyway. We all know it, so I've got nothing to lose by speaking truth." She looked past Jed to his men, her gaze sweeping across them. "How many of you are fathers, brothers, sons? How many of you started out as decent men before this monster turned you into killers?" I said, "Shut up. My brother was 17 when you took him. 17. And you would have worked him to death for money he never owed you." Clara May's voice grew stronger, powered by a lifetime of swallowed anger finally breaking free. "Every one of you has made that choice. Every one of you decided that taking the easy path was worth more than being able to look at yourself in a mirror." One of Jed's men shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Then another. Small movements, barely visible, but Boss saw them. Saw the cracks beginning to form. "You want to know why you're all so afraid of one man with a badge?" Clara May wasn't done. "Because deep down, you know you're wrong. You know what you're doing is evil. And you're terrified that someone might make you pay for it." Jed's face had gone purple with rage. "Last warning, bitch!" The shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Amos, positioned on a rooftop, had been waiting for his moment. The bullet took the man holding Clara May's horse in the shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. The horse reared, panicked, and Clara May threw herself sideways, tumbling free, even as Jed's gun discharged into empty air, and Boss moved. He'd been coiled tight as a spring, every muscle ready, waiting for the smallest opening. He covered 20 feet before Jed's men processed what was happening, his gun clearing leather with liquid speed. His first shot took the rider closest to Clara May through the chest. His second shattered another man's gun hand. Then the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from every window, every rooftop, every barricade. The townspeople of San Miguel, who'd been ready to surrender seconds before, found their courage in Clara May's defiance and Boss's charge. They might die, probably would die, but they'd die fighting instead of cowering. Boss reached Clara May and hauled her behind a water trough as bullets tore up the ground around them. She was shaking, gasping for air, but alive. He shoved her toward the nearest building. "Run! Get inside and stay down!" She ran, stumbling but upright, and Boss turned back to face Jed's men. They were scattering, some charging forward, others wheeling their horses around to find cover. Jed himself sat his mount in the middle of the street, his face twisted with fury, shouting orders that were lost in the thunder of gunfire. Boss fired methodically, each shot finding its mark. He'd learned long ago not to waste ammunition on fear or anger. Emotion ruined aim. He fired like a machine, cold and precise, and men fell from their saddles with neat red flowers blooming on their chests. A rider charged him, gun blazing. Boss dropped to one knee, felt the wind of bullets passing over his head, and put 2 rounds through the horse's chest. The animal went down hard, pinning its rider beneath its weight. The man's screams were lost in the general cacophony. Amos's rifle cracked again from the rooftop. 1 shot, 1 body falling. Wesley Cooper was firing from the general store, his aim wild but enthusiastic. All along the street, ordinary people were making extraordinary choices, standing up against men who'd terrorized them for years. But Jed's gang were professionals, and they were recovering from their initial shock. They found cover behind their fallen horses, behind water troughs and wooden posts, and began returning fire with devastating efficiency. The window where Wesley had been shooting exploded in a shower of glass. Boss heard someone scream, a high, thin sound that cut through everything else. Boss emptied his revolver and rolled behind a corner of the jail to reload. His hands moved automatically, ejecting spent shells, thumbing fresh rounds into the cylinder. 6 bullets. Against how many men? 15? 12? Hard to count in the confusion. A shadow fell across him. Boss looked up to see one of Jed's men rounding the corner, gun raised. Time seemed to slow, to crystallize into perfect clarity. Boss could see every detail: the man's scarred cheek, his yellowed teeth, the rust on his gun barrel, could see death approaching with mathematical certainty. Then Tommy Henderson appeared from inside the jail, swinging a shovel like a club. The metal blade caught the gunman across the jaw with a sickening crunch. The man went down hard, his gun clattering away across the boards. "Even?" Tommy gasped, offering Boss a hand up. Boss took it, hauling himself to his feet. "Even." He snapped the cylinder closed and moved back to the street corner. "Now get back inside before you get yourself killed." But Tommy didn't move. He picked up the fallen man's gun, checked it with the awkward motions of someone who'd never held one before, and took up position beside Boss. "My sister almost died because of them. Figure I've got some say in how this ends." There was no time to argue. Boss nodded once, and together they stepped back into the fight. The battle had spread throughout the town now, Jed's men having pushed forward into cover among the buildings. It had become a street fight, close and brutal, the kind where every corner could hide death. Boss moved through it like he'd been born to it, his instincts honed by years of hunting men through hostile territory. He cleared a corner and found 2 of Jed's men trying to break into the boarding house where the women and children sheltered. Boss's first shot dropped one. The other spun, bringing his gun around, and Boss squeezed the trigger. Click. Empty. He'd miscounted. The gunman smiled, taking his time to aim. Then Amos's rifle barked again, and the man's head snapped back in a spray of red. Boss looked up to see the old scout already working the bolt, searching for his next target. Boss reloaded on the run, heading for the boarding house. He had to secure it, had to make sure the non-combatants were safe. He was halfway there when he saw Jed. The outlaw leader had dismounted and was stalking down the street with 3 of his men, moving with deadly purpose toward the boarding house, toward the women and children, toward everyone Boss had sworn to protect. "Jed!" Boss's voice cut through the gunfire. "This is between us. Leave them out of it." Jed stopped, turned slowly. His face was spattered with blood, his own or someone else's. Impossible to tell. He was smiling, but it was the smile of a rabid dog, all teeth and madness. "Between us?" Jed laughed. "This stopped being between us the moment you decided to play hero. Now it's about teaching a lesson, about showing every town in this territory what happens when someone crosses me. You want to teach a lesson? Fine. Me and you, right here, right now. Winner takes all. You think I'm stupid enough to give you a fair fight? I don't fight fair. I fight to win." Jed gestured to his men. "Kill him." They raised their guns, and Boss knew he was too far away, too exposed, too... Gunfire ripped through the air, but not from Jed's men, from behind them. From the saloon, where Jack Reeves stood with a shotgun, smoke curling from both barrels. 2 of Jed's men went down hard, torn apart by buckshot at close range. Reeves locked eyes with Boss across the bloody street. "I'm a businessman," he called out, "and dead towns don't generate profit." He retreated back into the saloon, and more gunfire erupted from its windows. Other merchants were joining him, men who'd been content to pay tribute but had finally seen which way the wind was blowing. They might not have been brave, but they were practical, and right now practicality meant backing the winning side. Jed was screaming now, his careful plan dissolving into chaos. His men were falling back, their numbers cut in half, their leader's invincibility proven to be an illusion after all. Some were already running, spurring their horses toward the edge of town. But Jed himself wasn't running. He stood in the middle of the street, his gun raised, searching for Boss with eyes that had gone beyond rage into something colder, more final. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about making someone pay. Boss stepped out from cover, meeting Jed's gaze. Around them, the gunfire was tapering off, the battle winding down as Jed's surviving men realized their cause was lost. But between Boss and Jed, the war was just beginning. "You should have taken the money," Jed said, his voice eerily calm. "Should have walked away. But you had to be a hero, had to save the town, and now look what you've done. Good men are dead because of you." "The only good man who died today was the one you killed before I got here," Boss said. "Everyone else was just a bully with a gun." "And what are you? Some kind of saint? You're the same as me. You just dress it up in a badge and call it justice." "Maybe. But at least when I kill someone, it's because they gave me no choice. You kill because you like it." Jed's smile returned, sharp and cold. "True enough. And I'm going to like killing you most of all." They stood 40 feet apart, the distance of a classic showdown, though nothing about this was classic. The street was littered with bodies and spent brass. Buildings smoldered where stray shots had kindled fires. The smell of gunpowder and blood hung heavy in the air. Boss's gun was in his hand, hanging loose at his side. Jed's was the same. The mathematics of it were simple. Whoever drew and fired first would live. Whoever hesitated would die. Speed and accuracy. And that's all it came down to. "On three?" Jed asked mockingly. "Counts for children," Boss said. "This ends when one of us is dead." "Fair enough?" They stared at each other across the bloody space between them. Boss could feel his heartbeat, could feel the weight of the gun in his hand, could feel every second stretching out like taffy. He'd been in gunfights before, had faced down desperate men in dusty streets from Texas to Montana. But this was different. This mattered in a way those others hadn't. This was about more than survival. This was about proving that courage could triumph over cruelty, that justice wasn't just a word people threw around to make themselves feel better. This was about showing Clara May and Tommy and Wesley and all the others that standing up meant something. Jed's hand twitched. Boss fired. The two shots came so close together they were almost one sound. Boss felt something tug at his sleeve, Jed's bullet, missing by inches. His own shot took Jed high in the chest, right side, spinning the outlaw leader around. But Jed didn't go down. He steadied himself, raised his gun with shaking hands, and fired again. This shot caught Boss in the left shoulder, the impact like being hit with a hammer. Boss staggered, but stayed upright, his own gun coming back around. They fired together again. Boss felt something burn across his ribs. Jed grunted as another round punched through his gut. But still the outlaw stayed on his feet, his face twisted in a rictus of determination and hate. "Die!" Jed screamed, firing wildly now, his aim destroyed by pain and shock. "Just die!" Boss's next shot hit Jed in the throat, and the outlaw's scream became a wet gurgle. Blood sprayed from the wound, painting the dusty street red. Jed dropped to his knees, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. He looked up at Boss with disbelief, as if even now he couldn't comprehend losing. Boss walked forward, each step sending pain lancing through his wounded shoulder and ribs. He stopped a few feet from the kneeling outlaw and lowered his gun. "You were wrong," Boss said quietly. "Power doesn't come from fear. It comes from the people who have the courage to stand up when everyone says it's impossible." Jed tried to speak, but only blood came out. His eyes held Boss's for another moment, filled with confusion and rage and the terrible understanding that everything he'd built was crumbling. Then the light went out of them, and he pitched forward into the dirt. Boss stood over the body, swaying slightly. His shoulder was on fire, his ribs screamed with each breath, but he was alive. Around him, the town of San Miguel was silent, everyone staring at the fallen tyrant, trying to process what had just happened. Then someone started clapping. Boss turned to see Amos limping down from his rooftop position, bringing his hands together in slow, deliberate applause. Others joined in, Wesley Cooper, his face bleeding but grinning, Jack Reeves from the saloon doorway, the rancher who'd threatened Boss just days before, even Mayor Finch emerging from wherever he'd hidden during the fight, his eyes wide with wonder. Clara May broke through the crowd and threw herself at Boss, catching him in a hug that made his wounds scream but which he endured without complaint. She was crying and laughing at the same time, her whole body shaking. "You did it," she sobbed. "You actually did it." "We did it," Boss corrected, gently extricating himself from her grip before he fell over. "All of us. This wasn't me against him. This was a town deciding it was tired of being afraid." Tommy appeared, still holding the gun he'd taken, his face smudged with powder burns. Brother and sister embraced, and Boss turned away to give them privacy. He found himself face to face with Mayor Finch. The mayor was weeping, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "I'm sorry," he said brokenly. "I'm so sorry. I should have done this years ago. Should have stood up, should have fought, Should haves don't matter," Boss interrupted. "What matters is what you do next." Finch nodded, wiping his eyes. "What do we do? About the bodies? About Jed's remaining men? About... First thing? Get me someone who can stitch a wound because I'm bleeding like a stuck pig and I'd prefer to keep most of it inside." Boss swayed again, and Amos was there, supporting him. "After that, we round up whoever from Jed's gang is still alive. They get trials, real ones, in front of a real judge. We do this legal and proper. And if they come back? If there are more of them out there?" Boss looked down at Jed's body, then back to Finch. "Then they'll find a town that knows how to fight, that's not afraid anymore. That's got a sheriff who won't back down and people who'll stand with him." He paused, then added, "But I don't think they'll come back." "Bullies are only dangerous when people believe they can't be stopped. We just proved that wrong." They helped Boss to the doctor's office, a tiny room behind the general store where an old man with shaking hands and surprising skill cleaned and stitched his wounds. Boss gritted his teeth through it, refusing the whiskey they offered for the pain. He needed to stay alert, needed to make sure the town didn't descend into retribution and lynching. As the doctor worked, people came and went, reporting on the aftermath. 7 of Jed's men dead, including Jed himself. 4 captured, 3 escaped. From the town's side, 2 dead, one of the ranchers who'd joined the fight, and a shopkeeper who'd taken a stray bullet through his window. Several wounded, but nothing that wouldn't heal. The price of freedom, Boss thought, always paid in blood. By evening, order had been restored. The bodies had been laid out in the undertaker's parlor. The prisoners were locked in the jail cells, awaiting transport to Silver Creek for trial. The freed captives from Jed's mining camp had been fed and given places to sleep, and the town had begun the slow process of coming to terms with what had happened. Boss sat on the jailhouse steps as the sun set, his shoulder and ribs bandaged tight, exhaustion settling over him like a physical weight. Amos joined him, offering a cup of coffee that Boss accepted gratefully. "That was about as close as I ever want to cut it," Amos said. "Another inch on that throat shot, and Jed could have kept fighting. But he didn't." Boss sipped the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. "He died, and the town lived. That's what matters." "You planning to stay, now that the job's done?" Boss considered the question. He'd been planning to move on once Jed was handled, to find the next town that needed help, the next injustice to correct. That's what he did. Rode in, fixed what was broken, rode out, never staying long enough to put down roots or let people get too comfortable with him. But San Miguel was different. These people had found their courage, yes, but courage needed nurturing, needed someone to remind them why they'd fought, what they'd fought for. The badge on his chest, battered now, one corner bent from where a bullet had grazed it, felt heavier than it had before. Heavier with responsibility and purpose. "For a while," Boss said finally. "At least until they get a proper government established, until the territorial marshal can send someone permanent." He smiled slightly. "Besides, someone's got to make sure Finch doesn't backslide into cowardice." "Fair point." Amos drained his own coffee. "And after?" After, Boss looked out at the town, at the people moving through the gathering darkness, at the lights beginning to appear in windows. After, we find the next place that needs us. That's what we do. They sat in comfortable silence as night claimed San Miguel completely. In the saloon, someone started playing the piano, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. Music drifted down the street, carrying with it the promise of normalcy, of life continuing despite everything. Clara May appeared out of the darkness, climbing the steps to sit beside Boss. Her face was bruised, her dress still torn, but her eyes were clear. "Thank you," she said simply. "For Tommy. For all of us. Just doing my job." "It was more than a job. You risked everything. You could have died a dozen times today." Boss shrugged, then winced as the motion pulled at his stitches. "Could have. Didn't. That's what matters." "Will you stay? Permanently, I mean?" It was the second time someone had asked, and Boss found himself giving the same answer. "For a while. Not forever. I'm not built for forever." Clara May nodded, accepting this. "Then I guess we'll have to make the most of while." She stood, brushed dust from her skirts, and headed back toward her home. At the edge of the boardwalk, she turned back. "You know what you did here today? You showed us we didn't have to be victims. That's a gift that'll last long after you're gone, Sheriff Kane." She disappeared into the night, and Boss sat with those words, turning them over in his mind. Maybe that was the real victory, not killing Jed, not winning the fight, but showing people they had power they'd forgotten about. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The badge on his chest caught starlight, gleaming in the darkness. Boss touched it gently, feeling the bent corner, the scratches, the weight of everything it represented. He'd worn it for less than a week, but it felt like a lifetime. Felt like it had always been there, would always be there. And maybe it would. Maybe not this specific badge in this specific town, but the idea of it. The commitment to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. To be the line that evil could not cross. That was what a badge meant. Not power, not authority, but responsibility. The willingness to bleed so others wouldn't have to. Boss finished his coffee and stood, testing his wounds. Everything hurt, but nothing was broken beyond repair. He'd live. More importantly, so would San Miguel. "Get some sleep," he told Amos, "and tomorrow we've got paperwork to file, statements to take, a whole mess of legal business to sort through." "The glamorous life of a lawman," Amos said dryly, but he was smiling. Boss went inside the jail, to the cot in the cell he'd claimed as his own. He lay down carefully, his body screaming protests, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the town continued its celebration, music and laughter, and the sound of people rediscovering joy. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond San Miguel, in all the other towns and territories where fear still ruled, others were waiting. Waiting for someone to stand up. Waiting for someone to show them it was possible. Boss closed his eyes, let exhaustion take him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve. But tonight, just for tonight, he let himself feel something rare and precious, satisfaction. The knowledge that he'd done what he'd come to do. He'd kept his oath, protected those who couldn't protect themselves, brought justice to a place where it had been absent for too long. And in the morning, when the sun rose on San Miguel's first day of true freedom, Boss Kane would still be there. Standing watch, keeping the peace, until the next town needed him, until the next badge found its way into his hands, until the next person stood in the dust and decided that enough was enough. That was the life he'd chosen. And lying there in the darkness, wounds aching, exhaustion pulling him under, Boss wouldn't have traded it for anything. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. Normalcy returning to San Miguel like water flowing back into a dried riverbed. Boss woke to find his wounds had stiffened overnight, every movement a reminder of yesterday's violence. But he'd had worse. He'd survived this too. Amos was already up, making coffee and frying bacon on the stove. The old scout glanced over as Boss emerged from the cell, moving like a man 3 times his age. "You look like death chewed you up and spit you back out," Amos observed. "Feel worse than I look." Boss accepted the coffee gratefully, letting the heat work its way through him. Through the window, he could see the town stirring, people emerging cautiously, as if testing whether yesterday's freedom was real or just a fever dream. The prisoners give you any trouble? Quiet as church mice. Think they're still processing the fact that Jed's actually dead. Amos flipped the bacon. Jack Reeves stopped by early. Says he wants to talk to you when you're ready. Sounded almost respectful. That's a first. Boss moved to the window, watching San Miguel wake up. The blood had been scrubbed from the street during the night, probably by the women, working in quiet solidarity to erase the physical evidence of violence, even as its memory burned itself into the town's collective consciousness. Bodies had been removed, broken windows boarded up, shell casings swept away. But the change that had happened here was permanent, written in something deeper than blood or bullet holes. The door opened without a knock, and Mayor Finch entered. He looked different, straighter somehow, like a puppet whose strings had been cut and who'd discovered he could stand on his own after all. His eyes were clearer, his hands steady. "Sheriff," Finch said, and the title came out naturally this time, without the bitter taste of before. "The town council would like to meet with you, this afternoon, if possible." Didn't know San Miguel had a town council. We didn't. We do now. Formed it last night. Figured if we're going to do this right, we need proper governance. Laws that mean something. Accountability. Finch paused, then added, "We also voted to make your position permanent. Not temporary, not provisional. Full sheriff with a real salary and the town's complete backing." Boss turned from the window to study the mayor. "And if I say no, then we'll respect that. But we're hoping you'll say yes, at least for a while. Help us build something worth protecting." Finch's voice carried a quiet plea. "Yesterday, you showed us we could fight. Now we need you to show us how to live without fear, how to build instead of just survive." Before Boss could answer, the door burst open again. Tommy Henderson stood there, his face flushed with urgency. "Sheriff, you need to come quick. There's riders approaching from the north, at least a dozen of them." Boss felt his stomach tighten. Jed's remaining men coming for revenge? Or reinforcements who hadn't gotten word of yesterday's battle? Either way, San Miguel wasn't ready for another fight so soon. Too many wounded, too much exhaustion. They'd won once through desperation and luck. Lightning didn't strike twice. He grabbed his gun belt, wincing as the motion pulled at his stitches, and headed outside. The street was already filling with people, their faces showing the same fear that had defined them for years. That quick, that easily, terror came flooding back. But this time Boss noticed something different. People weren't running or hiding. They were standing in the street watching the northern approach, waiting to see what would happen. Afraid, yes, but present. Facing it instead of fleeing from it. Boss positioned himself in the middle of the street, the same spot where he'd faced Jed yesterday. His shoulder throbbed, his ribs screamed protest, but he stood straight. Behind him, he heard Amos take up position, heard the sound of rifles being readied in windows and on rooftops. San Miguel preparing to defend itself again if necessary. The riders appeared through the heat shimmer, resolving into distinct shapes. Boss counted 13 men, all mounted, all armed. But something was wrong, off about the way they rode. No aggression in their approach, no hostile formation. They moved like men coming to parley, not fight. They stopped 50 yards out, and the lead rider dismounted. He was older than most of the others, maybe 50, with iron gray hair and a face carved by wind and worry. He raised his hands, palms out, showing he came in peace. "I'm looking for Sheriff Kane," he called. "You found him," Boss replied, his hand resting easy on his gun. "State your business." The gray-haired man walked forward slowly, his hands still raised. As he got closer, Boss could see the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, the way his shoulders slumped with the weight of something heavy. "Name's Marcus Webb. I rode with Jed Calder." He said it like a confession, the words costing him something. "Heard what happened yesterday. Heard Jed's dead and his operation's finished." "That's right." Webb stopped 10 feet away, and Boss could see tears tracking through the dust on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for killing that son of a bitch." The words hung in the air, unexpected and raw. Boss's hand moved away from his gun. "Jed took my boy," Webb continued, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. 3 years ago. Said Danny owed him money for a horse that was supposed to be stolen. I had to ride for him. had to do things, terrible things, to keep Danny alive, every day wondering if this would be the day Jed decided my boy wasn't useful anymore. Where's your son now? That's why I'm here, Webb gestured to the other riders. All of us were fathers, brothers, husbands, men who rode for Jed because he had something we loved and threatened to destroy it if we didn't obey. When word spread that you'd freed the prisoners from the mining camp, that Jed was dead, he wiped his eyes roughly. We came to get our families, to take them home, if you'll let us. Boss looked past Webb to the other riders. He could see it now, the same exhaustion, the same desperate hope. These weren't killers coming for revenge. These were victims finding their way to freedom. The prisoners from the mining camp are at the boarding house, Boss said. But understand this. Any man who rode with Jed, who hurt people, who broke the law, that debt doesn't disappear just because Jed's gone. You'll answer for what you did. I know, Webb said. We all know. But at least now our families will be safe. That's worth whatever punishment comes. He paused. And Sheriff? If you need men to testify against the others, the ones who chose to ride for Jed, who weren't forced, we'll do it. We'll tell the truth about everything, what he did, how he operated, all of it. That's a start. Boss turned to Tommy, who'd been listening with wide eyes. Take Mr. Webb and his men to the boarding house. Let them reunite with their families, but keep watch. We verify every story before anyone leaves town. Tommy nodded and led the riders away. Boss watched them go, feeling something shift inside him. The world wasn't as simple as he'd thought. Not everyone who rode with outlaws was evil. Some were just people caught in impossible situations, making the only choices that kept their loved ones alive. Amos appeared at his elbow. That changes things. Everything changes things, Boss said. That's what change does. The morning unfolded in a series of reunions and revelations. Men were matched with the family members they'd been protecting. Stories spilled out. Extortion schemes more complex than Boss had imagined. A network of coercion and control that had extended through 3 territories. Jed hadn't just been an outlaw. He'd been building a kingdom of fear, brick by brick, victim by victim. Boss spent hours taking statements, documenting crimes, building cases that would stand up in court. The 4 prisoners from Jed's gang who'd survived yesterday's battle were interrogated. 2 broke immediately, offering to testify in exchange for lighter sentences. 1 stayed silent. The 4th, a hard-eyed man named Crane, sneered at Boss's questions. You think you've won something, Crane said from behind the bars. You think killing Jed ended it, but he was just one man. There are others like him all over this territory. Stronger men, meaner men. And they're going to hear what you did here. They're going to come looking. Let them come, Boss said simply. They'll find what Jed found. Death? Justice. And a town that won't back down. Crane laughed, a harsh sound without humor. You're a fool. This badge you're so proud of, it's a target. You painted it on yourself, and sooner or later, someone's going to take the shot. Probably. Boss stood, done with the interrogation. But until then, I've got work to do, and you've got a trial to prepare for. He left Crane in his cell and found Clara May waiting outside the jail. She'd cleaned up, changed clothes, bound her bruises with clean bandages. But more than her physical appearance had changed, she carried herself differently, head high, shoulders back, the posture of someone who'd survived the worst and come through stronger. Tommy's leaving, she said without preamble. Heading to Denver with some of the other men who were freed. Says he wants to make something of himself, somewhere Jed's shadow doesn't reach. That bother you? No. Clara May smiled, though sadness touched the edges of it. He deserves a fresh start. Somewhere he can be young without being scared. She looked up at Boss. I'm staying, though. Someone needs to run the farm, and besides, she gestured to the town around them. This is home. It's broken and battered, but it's mine. I'm not running from it. Town could use people like you. Could use people like you more. Clara May's expression turned serious. You're staying, aren't you? Not forever, but for a while? Seems that way. Good. She reached out and touched the badge on his chest, her fingers gentle. Because what you did here, It wasn't just about killing Jed. It was about showing us we mattered, that we were worth fighting for. Don't take that away from us by leaving too soon. She walked away before Boss could respond, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of responsibility that grew heavier with each passing hour. The town council meeting happened that afternoon in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold everyone who wanted to attend. Boss sat at a table in the front while what seemed like half of San Miguel crowded in. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey, but underneath it was something else. Anticipation. Hope. Mayor Finch called the meeting to order, his voice stronger than Boss had ever heard it. We're here to discuss San Miguel's future, to decide what kind of town we want to be now that we're free to choose. Jack Reeves stood first, and the crowd quieted. The saloon owner had cleaned himself up, put on his best suit, but the events of yesterday had left their mark. He looked older somehow, humbled. I want to start by apologizing, Reeves said, the words clearly costing him. I was wrong. About Sheriff Kane, about fighting back, about all of it. I chose profit over principle, and people died because of it. I can't undo that. But I can do better going forward. He looked directly at Boss. I'd like to propose that the town formally employ Sheriff Kane at double the territorial rate, and that we establish a fund to support the families of those who died in yesterday's battle. I'll contribute the first $100. A murmur went through the crowd. Wesley Cooper stood next. I'll match that. $100. Others rose, offering what they could. $10, $5, even loose change. The sum grew, a tangible measure of gratitude and commitment. Boss watched it happen with something approaching awe. This was what community looked like when fear no longer poisoned it. When the pledges finished, Mayor Finch turned to Boss. Sheriff Kane, will you accept our offer? Will you stay and help us build something better? Boss stood slowly, his wounds making the motion awkward. He looked around the crowded saloon, at the faces watching him with hope and trust. A week ago, these same people had wanted him gone, had seen him as a threat to their carefully maintained status quo. Now they were offering him a future. I'll stay, Boss said. For 6 months. Help you get organized, train a deputy, establish real law enforcement. After that, we'll see. He paused, making sure everyone understood. But understand this. If I stay, we do things right. No corruption, no special treatment, no looking the other way when someone with money or influence breaks the law. The law applies to everyone equally, or it applies to no one. Agreed, Finch said immediately, and others echoed him. And we rebuild that mining camp, turn it into something useful, a school maybe, or a hospital, something that helps instead of hurts. We'll start next week, Wesley said. Boss nodded, satisfied. Then I accept. For 6 months. We'll see where things stand after that. The meeting dissolved into celebration, people crowding around Boss to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their own stories of suffering under Jed's rule. Boss endured it with patience, though his wounds screamed protest and exhaustion pulled at him like an anchor. Finally, he extracted himself and stepped outside into the cooling evening air. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. San Miguel spread out before him, battered but breathing, wounded but alive. Amos joined him on the boardwalk. 6 months, huh? Didn't think you had it in you to commit to anything longer than a week. Neither did I. Boss leaned against a post, taking the weight off his aching body. But these people, they need time. Time to heal, time to build, time to remember how to live without fear. Can't do that in a week or a month. And after 6 months? After? We'll see. Maybe they'll be ready to stand on their own. Maybe they won't. Either way, there'll be other towns that need help. Other places where someone needs to stand up. Boss looked at his friend. You don't have to stay with me. 6 months in one place. That's a long time for a man used to moving. Where else am I going to go? Amos said gruffly. At my age, a comfortable bed and regular meals sound pretty good. Besides, someone's got to keep you from getting yourself killed. They stood together in comfortable silence as night claimed the town. One by one, lamps were lit in windows, small points of light pushing back the darkness. Music drifted from the saloon. The piano player had returned and someone was singing, their voice carrying through the still air. Over the next weeks, San Miguel transformed. The physical damage from the battle was repaired, windows replaced, bullet holes patched, blood stains scrubbed away. But the deeper healing took longer. People who'd lived in fear for years didn't shed it overnight. They flinched at loud noises. They watched the northern road with anxious eyes. They jumped when strangers rode into town. But slowly, incrementally, they began to relax, to remember what normal felt like. Children played in the streets again. Women walked without hunching their shoulders. Men laughed in the saloon without constantly checking the door. Boss established routines, morning patrols, evening check-ins, paperwork that documented every arrest and complaint. He hired a deputy, a young man named Daniel Frost, who'd fought bravely during the battle and showed promise as a lawman. Together, they built something that resembled actual law enforcement instead of the hollow shell that had existed before. The trial of Jed's surviving gang members took place in Silver Creek, with Boss and others from San Miguel testifying. 2 were sentenced to hang, 1 to 20 years in territorial prison, 1 to 10 years. Marcus Webb and the other coerced riders were given suspended sentences in exchange for their testimony and commitment to restitution. Justice, imperfect but real. News of what happened in San Miguel spread through the territory like wildfire. Other towns began reaching out, asking for advice, for help, for the courage to stand up against their own tyrants. Boss responded when he could, offering guidance, sometimes riding out with Amos to provide support during critical moments. The mining camp was indeed converted, not to a school or hospital, but to something else entirely. A place where men who'd lost their way could come to work honestly, to earn wages fairly, to rebuild their lives. Marcus Webb ran it, pouring his guilt and gratitude into making it something good. Clara May reopened her farm, hiring some of the freed prisoners to help work the land. It prospered, and she with it, the trauma of what she'd endured carving her into something harder and more resilient. She and Boss formed an unlikely friendship, 2 people who'd stared down death and refused to blink. Tommy wrote from Denver. He'd found work as a clerk and was studying law at night. Someday, he wrote, he'd come back as an attorney, help San Miguel build a proper legal system. Boss believed he would. The 6 months passed in a blur of activity and slow healing. Boss's wounds faded to scars, pale lines on dark skin that he'd carry for the rest of his life. Reminders of the price of justice, of the cost of courage. As the half-year mark approached, the town council met again to discuss the future. Boss attended, knowing what they'd ask before the words were spoken. "Stay," Mayor Finch said simply. "Not for another 6 months. Permanently. This is your town now, Sheriff Kane. These are your people." Boss looked around the room at the faces he'd come to know. Wesley Cooper, whose store was thriving now that he didn't have to pay tribute. Jack Reeves, who'd found that honest business could be just as profitable as corrupt dealings. Clara May, who'd become a voice on the council, advocating for those without power. Daniel Frost, eager and earnest, learning the job with dedication that reminded Boss of his younger self. "I can't," Boss said, and watched disappointment cloud their faces. "But not for the reasons you think. This town doesn't need me anymore. You've got Daniel. He's ready to be sheriff. Young, dedicated, knows the people and the land. He'll do right by you. But listen to me." Boss's voice carried the authority that came from absolute conviction. "What you needed wasn't a permanent sheriff. You needed someone to show you that standing up was possible, that courage could triumph over cruelty. You've learned that lesson. You've internalized it. Now you need to prove you can maintain it without me." "And what will you do?" Clara May asked quietly. "What I've always done. Find the next place that needs help, the next town living under someone's thumb, the next group of people who've forgotten they have power." Boss touched the badge on his chest, polished now, the bent corner beaten straight, but still the same piece of metal that had started this journey. "This badge means something because of what you all did. Not just me. All of you. And there are other places, other towns where people need to remember that." The silence that followed was heavy but not sad. Understanding, perhaps. Acceptance. "When will you leave, Bud?" Finch asked. End of the week, give Daniel time to settle into the job, make sure everything's in order. The remaining days passed quickly, a whirlwind of final preparations and quiet goodbyes. Boss walked the streets of San Miguel one last time, memorizing details. The way the morning light hit the mountains, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. This town had changed him as much as he'd changed it, had shown him that the fight was worth fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. On his final morning, what seemed like the entire town gathered to see him off. Boss and Amos packed their saddlebags in silence, checking their gear with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this 100 times before. Their horses stamped impatiently, sensing the journey ahead. Daniel Frost stood beside them, the sheriff's badge newly pinned to his chest. He looked terrified and determined in equal measure. "You're going to be fine," Boss told him. "Trust your instincts. Treat people fairly. Don't let fear make your decisions. Do that, and you'll be a good sheriff. I'll try to live up to what you started here. Don't live up to me. Live up to the town. Live up to the people who fought beside you. That's all anyone can ask." Clara May appeared with a wrapped package. Food for the road, Boss knew without opening it. She'd been doing this every time he and Amos went out on patrol, making sure they didn't go hungry. "You'll come back sometime?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Maybe. Someday. When you need a reminder of what you accomplished here." Boss smiled. "But I don't think you'll need reminding. I think you'll do just fine. We wouldn't have done anything without you." "No." Boss's voice was gentle but firm. "You'd have done it eventually. I just hurried it along. The courage was always there, Clara May. In you, in Tommy, in all of them. Sometimes people just need someone to go first, to prove it's possible. But the actual doing, that was all you." She embraced him quickly, then stepped back. No tears this time. Just gratitude and the quiet strength of someone who'd survived the fire and emerged tempered like steel. Mayor Finch was next, extending his hand. Boss shook it, feeling how much steadier the grip was than it had been 6 months ago. "Thank you," Finch said simply, "for giving me back my dignity, for showing me that cowardice wasn't inevitable. You did that yourself. I just provided the opportunity." Others came forward. Wesley Cooper, Jack Reeves, the ranchers and merchants and ordinary people who'd found extraordinary courage. Each had something to say, some word of thanks or farewell. Boss accepted it all with quiet grace, uncomfortable with praise but understanding its necessity. Finally, there was nothing left but the leaving. Boss swung into his saddle, feeling the familiar creak of leather, the solid weight of the horse beneath him. Amos mounted beside him, and together they turned their horses toward the road that led out of San Miguel. "Sheriff Kane," someone called. Boss turned to see Tommy Henderson riding hard from the edge of town, his horse lathered with sweat. The young man pulled up beside them, breathing hard. "Thought you were in Denver," Boss said. "I was. Came back for this." Tommy reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a book, leather-bound, thick, official-looking. "It's a history of what happened here, what you did, what we all did. I interviewed everyone, documented everything, so people will remember, so other towns facing the same darkness will know it's possible to fight back." Boss took the book, running his fingers over the embossed title, "The Battle of San Miguel, How One Town Reclaimed Its Freedom." He opened it to the first page and read the dedication, "To Sheriff Ryder Boss Kane, who taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it." "I can't accept this," Boss said, trying to hand it back. "You already have." Tommy grinned. "Besides, there are copies, dozens of them, being distributed to every town in 3 territories. Your story, our story, is going to spread. And maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire others to stand up." Boss looked down at the book in his hands, at the record of what had happened here. Not a legend or myth, but documented truth. Evidence that tyranny could be defeated, that ordinary people could find extraordinary courage when pushed far enough. "Thank you," Boss said finally, tucking the book into his saddlebag, "for remembering, for making sure it meant something." "It meant everything," Tommy said simply. Boss and Amos rode out of San Miguel as the sun climbed higher, turning the Colorado morning bright and clear. Boss looked back once, seeing the town spread out behind him, people waving, Daniel Frost standing tall with the sun glinting off his badge, smoke rising from chimneys as life continued its eternal rhythm. "Think they'll be all right?" Amos asked as the town disappeared behind them. "Yeah," Boss said with certainty. "They'll be fine. Better than fine. They'll thrive." "So where to now?" Boss pulled out a folded paper from his pocket, a letter that had arrived last week from a town called Redemption, 200 miles south. The message was brief. "We've heard what happened in San Miguel. We need help. Please come." "South," Boss said, pointing his horse toward the distant horizon. "Town called Redemption. Seems appropriate." "Another tyrant?" "Probably. There's always another one. Always another group of people living in fear, waiting for someone to show them they don't have to." They rode in silence for a while, the mountains receding behind them, new territory opening up ahead. The badge on Boss's chest caught the sunlight, throwing brilliant reflections across the landscape. A signal, perhaps. A beacon for those looking for hope. "You ever think about stopping?" Amos asked. "Finding a place to settle? Putting down roots?" Boss considered the question. 6 months ago, he might have said no immediately, might have insisted that his path was solitary, that commitment was a chain he'd never wear. But San Miguel had changed something in him, had shown him that connection wasn't weakness, and that leaving a place didn't mean leaving it behind. "Maybe someday," Boss said, "when the work is done." "The work's never done." "Then maybe I'll ride until I can't anymore." Boss smiled, feeling the pull of the road, the promise of the next town, the next fight, the next chance to make things right. "That sounds so bad?" "Sounds like you," Amos said, stubborn to the end. "I'll take that as a compliment." They rode on, two figures growing smaller against the vast landscape, heading toward whatever waited in the town called Redemption. Behind them, San Miguel continued its transformation from victim to victor, from a place defined by fear to one characterized by courage. The story of what happened there would spread, carried by Tommy's book and by word of mouth, whispered in saloons and shouted in town squares. The legend of Sheriff Ryder Boss Kane, the man who refused to kneel, who stood alone against impossible odds, and emerged victorious. But Boss knew the truth, carried it with him like a talisman against pride. He hadn't been alone. He'd never been alone. The real heroes were the people of San Miguel who'd found their courage, who'd chosen to stand when standing seemed suicidal. He'd just been the catalyst, the spark that ignited the fire that was always there, waiting for the right moment to burn. And now that fire was spreading, town by town, person by person, each one learning that fear's power was an illusion that shattered the moment someone chose to face it. Boss touched the badge on his chest, feeling its weight, its promise, its responsibility. This piece of metal had become more than an appointment or a symbol. It had become a covenant between him and everyone who needed someone to stand between them and the darkness. As long as there were towns living under tyranny, as long as there were people who'd forgotten their own strength, as long as there were bullies who thought power came from fear, he'd be there, riding in with the dawn, bringing justice to places that had forgotten what it looked like. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning cool. Ahead, the road stretched toward infinity, toward the next town, the next battle, the next chance to prove that one person with courage could change everything. Boss Kane rode toward that distant horizon, the badge on his chest gleaming bright, carrying with him the hopes of everyone who'd ever been afraid and chose to be brave instead. The lawman who refused to kneel, heading toward whatever came next. And somewhere behind him, in a town called San Miguel, people were learning to live without fear, learning to build instead of merely survive. Learning that the courage one man brought them was really just their own courage reflected back, polished bright enough to finally see. That was the real victory. Not the battle won, but the truth revealed, that tyranny only survives when good people do nothing. And in San Miguel, good people had finally done something. The rest of the world would learn, town by town, stand by stand, until the entire frontier knew that the age of outlaws ruling through fear was ending, and the age of justice, imperfect, hard-won, but real, was beginning. Boss Kane would make sure of it, one town at a time, for as long as it took, for as long as he drew breath. That was his oath, his calling, his purpose, and he would not, could not, walk away from it. Not until the work was done. And the work, as Amos had said, was never done. So Boss rode on into the bright morning toward the next town that needed him, carrying justice in his holster and hope in his heart. The lawman who proved that one person could make a difference. The sheriff who showed a broken world how to heal. The man who refused to kneel, teaching others to stand.